Coming to you from Kansas City, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government. I'm Lauren Palmer, the Director of Local Government Services for the Mid-America Regional Council, and your host for this episode. GovLove is produced by ELGL, the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network. You can support ELGL by becoming a member. Check out elgl.org for information on member perks and great low rates for individuals and organizations. Today, I'm visiting with guests from Engine, the New Growth Innovation Network. Betsey Suchanic is the Inclusive Economic Development Advisor, and Deirdre Shaw is the Inclusive Economic Growth Associate of Knowledge Management. They are joining the pod to talk about the launch of Elevating Equity in Economic Development, an Inclusive Recovery Toolkit. This resource is full of best practices and practical recommendations to help economic development practitioners implement inclusive strategies. Betsey and Dee, welcome to GovLove.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, you are welcome. I am really excited for this conversation today. But first, we want to begin with a lightning round to get to know both of you better. So Dee, I'm going to start with you. What was your best vacation and why?
My best vacation was to Phuket, Thailand. It was the very first time that I went on vacation without any members of my family. It was just a girls' trip, and we had to pay for it out of our own pockets. So it was kind of like a hostel style, cheap vacation, and it was amazing. I think it was the first time I felt like a full adult. And I was out with my girls and we were in a foreign country and we were exploring everything. We ate great Thai food. We went to Phi Phi Island. We sat out in the sun. We got massages. We did all of that. We came back completely broke. And it was amazing. It was amazing. It was the first time the girls in the group that said that they were going to go on a trip, we all actually made it out on the trip. So it was great.
Oh my gosh, that's so great. I'm like living vicariously through you. It's so funny how you started and said this was your first trip without members of your family. I just got back from vacation and I was telling everyone around the office, like, well, listen, this is a family trip and it's not a vacation. There's a difference. So I can totally relate with what you're saying about going on a girls' trip with all your friends. So I'm sorry that you came back broke, but it sounds like it was totally worth it.
Absolutely.
All right, great. Betsey, what about you? What was your best vacation?
Last summer, I actually had the pleasure of visiting friends out in Utah and had the opportunity to hike Bryce Canyon. And that was just an incredible trip, in large part because it was my first time sort of out west in that area. And I thought I was on another planet most of the time. It was like just such a different landscape and was so eye-opening in terms of just like the geography and sort of differences in landscape across the U.S. So it was my trip to the West, but also feeling like I was on the moon perhaps as well.
Yeah, I love that area of the world. So now where are you from? What's home base for you?
I'm originally from outside of Philadelphia, but I live in Washington, D.C. now.
Okay, so East Coast, like being out in the desert in Utah is definitely a big change.
Eye-opening and incredibly different, much less green.
Yeah, for sure. I love that area of the world too. Okay, very good. Well, Betsey, we're going to let you start with this next question. Tell us about the last movie you saw, either in the theater or maybe online, and do you recommend it?
So I, over the weekend, saw Oppenheimer, and I would recommend it, even though I would give fair warning that is a challenging watch and also very long. But I have not yet seen Barbie, which also came out, so I don't know if I can recommend a double feature as many of my friends have sort of undertaken.
Yeah, I saw Oppenheimer this weekend too, and I'm still like thinking about it.
It's so much. I feel like there's just so many aspects to be thinking about.
Yeah. And, you know, longtime listeners to the podcast will know I'm from Independence, Missouri. I'm a big Harry Truman file. So I'm watching this show, like, you know, sitting just less than a mile from the Truman Library, from the Truman home. And it was really kind of like the surreal experience of reflecting again on making that decision to drop the bomb. And Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to stop talking now. I could say a lot more about it. Agree. It was a fascinating film. But yeah, I haven't seen Barbie yet. It's on my list.
I've heard it's wonderful from folks so far, but I have not yet made it out, so I'm hoping maybe this week.
Barbie's definitely on my list.
Yeah, Dee, you're up. So you have not seen Barbie yet.
I haven't. I haven't
Okay.
seen it yet. Actually, the last movie I saw in the theaters was The Little Mermaid. It's the last
Oh,
movie I saw,
yeah.
the live action Little Mermaid. And I live in Central Florida. Actually, I live minutes away from Disney World. So we saw it at the theater at Disney property on opening night. Yes. There were 20 of us. We all went. No one in the theater sang along, but everybody clapped after the songs. Um, and I don't know how to explain being in a Disney theater on opening night for the Little Mermaid live action was an experience.
Yeah, I just love Little Mermaid too, but you're painting a different picture. I think it would have been more fun to see it the way that you were describing it.
Yeah. And Ursula is one of my favorite characters. She and Scar are my favorite villains. So, oh, and Cruella. So going to see that and seeing how well Melissa McCarthy did was great for me.
Yeah, she's awesome. I thought they did a really good job. I was really kind of hesitant to see it. Like live action underwater is just going to be weird, but they did a really good job.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Great recommendations. A lot of times I ask those questions and people are like, yeah, I saw this movie, but it was a total dud. So it's great to get two recommendations from my guests. All right, one more question. Dee will let you start. If you could have any superpower, what would it be and why?
I would have the power to teleport. Because I love going places, but I don't like having to get there. I have terrible traffic. Where I live, there's one road in and one road out. So if I need to go to the supermarket, it could take me 20 minutes to go 2 miles. Um, and sometimes people say that the journey is the destination. I am over that. If I could just go and teleport to somewhere else, skip the lines, skip the flights, I'd be fine. And then there's a saying that says, I said, "Oh, I'm stuck in traffic." And it is, you are the traffic. So I am the traffic. I understand that. But if I could teleport, I wouldn't have to worry about any of that.
That is profound. Good example. Betsy, what about you? What would be your superpower?
I think my superpower choice is entirely dependent on the fact that it is summer right now, but it would be to breathe underwater. And it's probably because I've been at the beach a couple times and have been going to the pool quite a bit. And I keep thinking how much faster I would be in the pool or swimming if I didn't have to breathe. So probably along those lines.
Oh, very cool. And we were just talking about The Little Mermaid. Like, wouldn't it be cool to go explore the depths of the sea?
Exactly. Exactly. So I basically want to be the Little Mermaid.
The
You could
mermaid
be part of their world.
world. Yes. Bingo. Exactly. Okay, well, very good. Great examples. Thank you for sharing a little bit about yourselves. And now we'll just get into the heart of our interview. So, just for our listeners, this is our second Govlove episode featuring our friends from Engine. Last summer, for episode 529, we had your colleague, Jessica Gonzalez Martinez, and Sterling Johnson from the Partnership from Southern Equity on Govlove to talk about the Communication Resource Guide for Inclusive Prosperity. So, for our listeners who missed that episode, and P.S., I highly recommend it, go back and rewatch 529 if you missed it. But just for context, Betsy, could you just remind us about Engine? What's your organizational mission and how your work intersects with local government?
Absolutely. So, New Growth Innovation Network is a network. That's exactly what we are. We are practitioners. We were founded by practitioners in 2019 that came together and said traditional economic development doesn't serve everybody in our regions, in our communities, in our cities, and there's a lot more work that can be done to sort of rethink how we're serving everybody in our community when we develop our local economies. And so that's the premise that Engine was founded on. And we've taken that approach in a number of different ways, from creating tools and resources for practitioners to doing research on sort of how we can better address capital gaps, and also thinking about it in regard to some of the resources that we'll share about today. My role fits into it in that I'm one of our advisors, so I get to work across a couple of our projects. So today we'll be sharing about the Inclusive Recovery Initiative, one project that I got to support. I also support our small and mid-sized city work. So we have a number of different programs and projects that all sort of tackle this idea of inclusive economic development in different topics, in different geographies, to sort of identify what are those solutions and how can we ensure that more places and people can implement them.
Awesome. And so tell us a little bit more about your career path. You said you're an advisor. How did you get into that role?
So I often joke that I somehow ended up working in economic development because I'm an artist, which is not as linear as you would think. But I'm a graphic designer and photographer. And while I was in school and building those skills, I found that freelancing was a really great thing to do on the side. But in doing that, I started getting a window into entrepreneurship and small business, which led me somehow down this very long pathway around how do we break down barriers for small business owners and entrepreneurs to either grow their business or start their business. And everything from like, what's the capital? What's the right supports? Do you have a business network? Do you have business partners? And so that window into local economies was what really led me to then go to grad school and my previous positions to look at how are the economic structures that we have and how do they continue to favor some and reinforce structural barriers for others, particularly along the lines of race, gender, and geography, all of which is exactly the work that Engine seeks to address in our approach. So while my background's a little bit more focused on entrepreneurship, I think that entrepreneurship and all of that work tied to economic growth is sort of this broader base of economic development. And so that's really why I ended up at Engine, and I'm really excited to be here today sharing about the tools that we've created.
Very cool. I love that background in art. We love to ask this question of our guests because there are just so many different stories and career paths into work in local government. And you definitely have an interesting one. So thank you for bringing your creativity to work in inclusive economic development.
Absolutely.
Okay, Dee, so we want to learn a little bit about you as well. Tell us about your role at Engine and your career path that led you into that work.
Well, thank you very much. My role here is as an inclusive economic growth associate, knowledge management, and it's kind of like helping put the pieces together. And I love it. It varies by project, and I really landed at the right place. I've been at Engine for almost a year, and it's been an interesting journey to get here. I started in my undergrad. I got a degree in economics, and actually was environmental and natural resource economics. And I wanted to save the planet, wanted to save the world, and then something happened that shook me. There was a major, what is it? The around the Christmas weekend, there was a major tsunami that happened in Thailand, and it shook me to my core because in like 15 seconds we lost 250,000 people, just like that. And I had a bit of an existential crisis, and then I actually became a missionary overseas after that. And after doing that, I was living in South Korea for a little bit and did a few things like in Philippines, and then I decided that I was going to go to grad school and do um, eh, I'm sorry, it's slipping my mind right now. I was going to go to grad school and do international development. So I went to grad school for international development economics and public policy. And after studying for a little bit, I graduated and then I tried to figure out what I was going to do. I went overseas a little bit, and then I decided that I was going to come back to the United States. And I ended up in rural Northwest Alaska in the Arctic, working for the tribes. And I worked in public health, um, in rural Alaska. And then I moved down to Juneau a little bit and I worked for the state. So I spent almost a decade in Alaska just working with the indigenous community in community development, um, public health, and the like. And then I moved back home to Florida where I worked in public health for a little bit. But actually, I got a little burned out from mortality statistics, and I was doing health equity at that time, and it's a little rough. Looking at the numbers of it was a little rough for me personally, and so I saw an opening for economic development. I had a degree in economics, but I wasn't really sure what to do. So I started out as an analyst for one of our local municipalities, and that's how I actually came to Engine. So from working from health equity to economic development, so now um, I'm doing this work here.
Wow, fascinating. You have had a huge range of experiences.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you for sharing that. I thought that was really interesting what you said about, there was a point when you were kind of disillusioned and didn't really know what to do, but, took a step that led to another step and found your way. And we love to kind of share those experiences on GovLove to help inspire our listeners who might be thinking about changes in their careers.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, Betsey, of course, we're here today to talk about the launch of the Inclusive Recovery Toolkit. So just start by telling us, what is this new resource?
Absolutely. So the Inclusive Recovery Toolkit is a online interactive web page, though we also have a PDF version for folks who like to have some printed or static things to flip through. But it's the culmination of the Inclusive Recovery Initiative that Engine has led for the last almost 2.5 years. That brought together a community of practice of regional economic development district practitioners from across the U.S., and then also our work that went in deep on 6 specific sites with 6 EDDs to look at what did equity look like in their planning, in the development of their comprehensive economic development strategies. And really, it's all of the lessons that we learned, everything that we heard from practitioners of, how are you working on this? And how are you doing this? And what are the examples that got you here? Or how are we telling the stories and bringing those voices together to the table? So the toolkit itself is a web page, but I like to think of it as sort of the culmination of everything that we've learned over the last 2.5 years from these sites, from these practitioners who have been interviewed, who've been shared on our calls, who've brought forth their ideas. And so it's an online toolkit that has 3 core sections and an idea bank that they can identify resources. But just wanted to reiterate that it really does come from a base of the work that we've done over the last 2.5 years.
So this was a 2.5 year initiative. What was the impetus for doing this work?
So we had the support of the U.S. Economic Development Administration in to conduct the Inclusive Recovery Initiative, and a lot of this work came from the motivation to we saw a lot of the inequities that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, in particular, economic inequities. We saw firsthand the impact on Black businesses were different than white businesses. We saw disparities in who could work remotely. We saw disparities in the statistics of who got COVID. So in every which way, we saw a lot of inequities that happened during the pandemic. And with this sort of reinforced drive for how do economic developers plan and incorporate equity in their work, and with the additional executive order mandate, the U.S. Economic Development Administration was also grappling with that question around what does this look like for the plans that our economic development districts put together, the comprehensive economic development strategy. And so that was the question that we really walked into. How do you plan for an inclusive recovery? How do we take the inequities that we're seeing and we create the right plans that will address those? And so really that was what started the work. But really what we saw firsthand was the importance of hearing from and learning from practitioners and communities, and being able to then sort of understand what was happening on the ground in the 6 sites that we were working on to sort of elevate and bring the right tools to all of those economic development districts struggling with that question.
Yeah, great. Obviously, I'm biased. I work for an EDD that's benefited from this effort and has learned a lot with you along the way. So I'm really glad to be able to highlight this important work for our GovLove audience. And kind of along that vein, in the local government world, there are lots of guides, toolkits, resources for local government professionals on lots of different topics, and including and maybe especially economic development. What sets this resource apart?
So I think this is such a good question because, again, you can't say that a toolkit will solve all the problems, but I like to think for us that, it is a toolkit. It is a guide. It has considerations, it has definitions and all of that. But I really feel like the huge value of the toolkit that we bring was the curation. To your exact point that there are so many guides and resources and toolkits out there, that what we really wanted to do was try to create a curated list of those resources to help folks dock into wherever they want to go. And so that was really the idea behind what we call the Idea Bank, which allowed folks to say, I'm looking for community engagement resources about this, or I'm looking for data tools or equitable data examples in the Austin EDA region. So allow them to look for examples of other EDDs who are doing this, to be able to filter for them and be able to zoom in right to where their question is. We were recently on a call, and someone was talking about sort of like, you introduce these really amazing frameworks or resources, but then sort of there you get all the way down to this friction of how do you implement them. And I like to think of our toolkit as something that will kind of go in between. So not only are we helping to try to provide resources and frameworks and approaches, but it's something that will help you with the friction of how do I word that survey question to ensure that I'm collecting the right demographic information? Or how do what are some things that I haven't thought of to address childcare gaps in my community? And what are some examples of what other EDDs are doing in that space? And so I think for us, I think for me, it's the curation that we tried not to recreate the wheel by creating, even more sort of repetitive guides, but we try to bring in a lot of those existing guides to create a pathway for folks who are like, instead of them months later going, oh, I wish I had known that thing existed. We're sort of able to provide them that as they're brainstorming, as they're thinking, and as they say, what does this actually look like for our region?
Yeah, great. So Dee, I want to pivot to you. I mean, we've been talking about this in the context of the EDA and the economic development districts, but who is really the target audience for the toolkit?
So I do have to piggyback on Betsey. She did such a great job of just explaining this to you. The target audience is economic development leaders. They're community leaders, and they are practitioners that do the work every single day. That's the target audience, people who get to work in creating the comprehensive economic development strategies, or SEDS. People who do build housing communities, people who work in small business development, people who work with entrepreneurs every single day, starting their businesses, looking to get microloans. This is who I see the toolkit built for.
Great. I mean, do you mention the work you did in Florida?
Yes,
You have a background as a practitioner. So maybe speaking from that practitioner perspective, what does this project mean to you?
wow, it's just it, so I consider myself a new practitioner. Just coming into the field, if I had this resource on hand, I think it would be easier for me to fight some of the battles that I had to do on the ground, or open some of these conversations, or even have ideas. We have an idea bank, which is it, it's just amazing, especially for someone who is a new practitioner, just getting in the game, being able to open it up and say, I had no idea these resources existed. I I haven't even had the opportunity to think about this, because economic development is it's not something that you can really be taught. It's something that you learn about, and we do it through this traditional lens, and equity is not front and center. And for me, I mean, it would mean being able to help. So I live in an area that's majority minority, and it would be being able to give small business developers more tools. It would be able to maybe talk to banking institutions. Um, for me, this toolkit is one of the best things that I've seen. Well, I'm tooting my own horn. Is one of the best. It's one of the best documents, or one of the best tools I have actually seen. And not just that, but for leaders. A lot of times, um, people have been doing things for 20, 30 years. They've been doing things one way. And when they see that there's research that has been done, there are other organizations, other leaders, other people that they might be familiar with in the field that are addressing inequities, maybe they won't feel alone. Maybe they won't feel like they're siloed, and that there are other solutions to some of the issues that they're dealing with.
Yeah, ending on solutions is a great segue into my next question. That what outcomes do you anticipate from communities embracing this toolkit?
I well, I'm a bit of an optimist, and I see using this toolkit as a great way to incorporate equity into communities. I see more participation with community leaders and government leaders. I see collaboration with diverse groups who maybe haven't spoken to each other before. This is a great way to foster communication for collaboration. Um, I see um, I see this toolkit just allowing for greater variance in businesses, and just revitalization of certain communities. Um, I just have so much hope for this toolkit, and like I said, maybe I'm uh, too optimistic. I just see it as a pathway for inclusive growth.
I don't think that's too optimistic. This really
Okay.
reminds me of something I discussed with Sterling and Jessica in our conversation last summer, kind of reflecting to them my experience in local government. Of like, there is this very traditional notion of community engagement in local government that's like, we're going to hold a meeting at City Hall at 6 o'clock on Thursday, and whoever shows up represents the will of the community. And what I have learned through, work with Engine and others is like, we got to totally rethink this notion of community engagement. And there are really some great resources in this toolkit to help local government practitioners on the ground really think about doing this work in a different way. So, Betsey, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about resources that Engine provides in addition to the toolkit to help economic developers who want to advance equity in their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I think, as I said in the beginning of the call, Engine, by definition, like the last N in our acronym, is network. And we are a network of practitioners. We really strive to have a community that brings folks together who are really interested in these topics to sort of learn from one another. And so, that being said, we do have an online platform. We have the Engine community, which is an online platform where you can go in and we have other practitioners who are also in there in many of our other programs to converse, to engage, to share resources, to post questions. And that's accessible at hub.newgrowth.org. And beyond sort of our online community, which sort of serves as the way that we allow and want to encourage practitioners to engage with each other as part of the network. We also have a number of different programs that we're tackling different topics and different lenses that we're looking at inclusive growth through. So Inclusive Recovery Initiative was one way that we were looking at how regions were planning for an inclusive recovery from COVID. But in addition to that, we're looking right now at how small and mid-sized cities are incorporating inclusive growth models into their economic development strategies. We're looking at economic mobility strategies through another one of our projects, the Advancing Economic Mobility work. And that's looking at how different areas are creating different wealth building strategies or creating new models around workforce that increase economic mobility. And so we have a range. One project that I'll make a note of that we have recently opened applications for is our Equity Impact Investments program, which is also supported by the Economic Development Administration. And that program is really seeking to bring coalitions of community partners together between economic development and community development. So really looking at what are the silos that we've seen arise between those two sort of partners and how can we ensure that they're actually working together, knowing how it can be really hard when you're working on the ground to build some of those partnerships with different aims, different ways that you're approaching these solutions. And so we're looking at how we can continue to build some local partnerships through this program to sort of look at how they can lead to more collective impact. So we have a wide range of topics that we're interested in and just a lot of different lenses that we're looking at inclusive growth through, but really want to encourage any practitioners who are interested to engage with Engine more, both in our online community or by applying to join any one of our sort of upcoming or active programs right now.
That's great. Certainly a lot of opportunities to get involved, and I want to encourage our listeners to take advantage of the resources that you offer. Dee, I want to go back to you. We kind of started this conversation about what the toolkit describes as a totally new approach to community engagement. So what does that approach look like, and why does it work to ensure inclusive economic prosperity?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you for asking that. I think about a lot of times they say, like, how do you invite more people to the table? But for me, I just think it's dismantling the table, starting all over again, and figuring out if we even need a table in the first place. You know, what are the traditional ways that we get community engagement? And you spoke about it earlier. We do surveys and we have public meetings, and then, there are traditional advisory boards. But we took the approach of looking at things in a non-traditional manner so that we can really engage and center community voice and reach people um, who we have maybe not ever spoken to or even listened to. Um, Rethinking about who's on our advisory board, the location of engagements, how we schedule those meetings, Do we have translation services? Do we have childcare at the meetings? Are people being paid to be advisors? Um, Broadening opportunities so that people's voices can not only be heard, but be listened to and incorporated in plans that not just benefit them, that they are part of. And so for me, it's just like starting over from what is established and building something new. And maybe it's not a table. Maybe it's a picnic blanket. Maybe it's, maybe it's something else, but making sure that the community and has the buy-in for their community.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I haven't heard it expressed that way before, that it's not just about creating a seat at the table. It's maybe totally rethinking the platform.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Um, Dee, in our discussion to prepare for this interview, you said something that I found really refreshing. And that's, you said that you have grown less cynical from doing this work, which is great. I talk to a lot of people in local government, and I think they struggle to combat their cynicism in doing local government and economic development work. So tell me, what is fueling your optimism?
Thank you for your question. I am really optimistic, and I'll just give a brief example why. I believe that I am standing on the shoulders of giants, of people who have come before me that have put in um, dedicated time and resources and work. Like even if we look at the the toolkit and we see the examples of what communities have done to strengthen their economy equitably, it gives me hope. A few years ago, I had a chance run in with Mr. Good Trouble himself, John John Lewis,
Oh,
Representative John Lewis, and that changed my life. I was a bit starstruck and I could barely speak. And he took the time to talk to me and he asked me about my life and what I was doing and how it affected me. And I could tell him, I could talk to him. I felt proud of where I was going, seeing what he has been through in his life and where we are now it just filled me with hope. So looking at the toolkit and what people have done or what they're doing in their communities, knowing that a few years ago, people never openly spoke about equity. After 2012, the summer, where the unfortunate, the murder of George Floyd got a lot of attention, where people just stopped and said, what are we doing? And how are we doing this? And there there has been so much change made on the ground. Of course, the news cycle is going to give you whatever is going to be the most sensational, whatever is going to get the most clicks, whatever is going to have the most revenue. But there are people on the ground every single day working hard to make their neighborhoods better, to grow their communities, and to do that by including everyone. And it just gives me so much optimism to be able to see it in a toolkit instead of just hearing about it a word of mouth. These are real life examples of what communities are doing. I just have so much hope for the future of not just economic development, but just communities.
it's awesome. That's what GovLove's all about: communities and hope for the future. So we're going to end on that note, but is there anything else that either of you would like to share before we wrap up?
No, just thank you so much for having us, Lauren, and giving us the opportunity to share about Engine and about the toolkit.
Absolutely. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's my pleasure. I feel personally passionate about this work and really proud to have had a teeny tiny little part in supporting Engine's work in this regard. And I really think that this has a lot of value for our listeners. So I was really proud to bring it forward to the GovLove audience. So my thanks to both of you for joining the GovLove podcast. And as we wrap up, Betsey, I'm going to ask you, if you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as our exit music for this episode?
So I'm actually going to totally steal. Dee had a really great thought on this question.
Awesome.
And she suggested, Dee, tell me if I misrepresent this, Rihanna's I Found Love in a Hopeless Place. We say that Rihanna is our inclusive growth mascot here at Engine. So that was our nod to her.
Awesome.
Absolutely. You know, she has that line, "Where have you been all my life?" And that's what I feel about this toolkit.
And finding love in a hopeless place.
Yeah.
Like, you're finding the optimism and the hope in work that's really hard and changing a lot of past bad wrongs. So awesome. I love that song and that suggestion. Thank you. Very cool to hear about Rihanna being your team mascot. So this ends our episode for today. Thanks so much to our guests, Betsey and Dee from Engine. Thank you for listening. You can reach us at elgl.org/GovLove or on Twitter at GovLove Podcast. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.